All right, let's continue with our Adventist Pioneer series. A good afternoon to you. A good morning if you're out there in the States, in the Caribbean, South America. A good morning to you. A good afternoon to you if you're in Europe and Africa. I'm going to be sipping on tea now and then. I hope you don't mind. In Johannesburg today, it's about 18 degrees Celsius. It's a bit cool and it's raining, so it's a perfect day for a cup of tea, not so much a glass of beer. In any case, cheers, and let's get into our lecture. In the last lecture, we discovered what William Miller was all about. In this lecture, we are going to look at Black Adventist pioneers. And the reason why I do these lectures, a quick disclaimer, is not to convert Seventh-day Adventists to Judaism. It is not to speak against Seventh-day Adventism. On the contrary, it is to show how God has worked in the Adventist movement for the benefit of Israelites and the Jewish people who are stuck in the churches. At the same time, it gives me an opportunity to answer questions that come from my Seventh-day Adventist friends with regards to the purpose and the history of Seventh-day Adventism. So that's why I'm doing these videos. So if I'm not mistaken, we talked about the disappointment in the last video, because what they expected was a second coming of Jesus in 1844. It never happened, and then Miller proposed another date. It didn't happen, and the Baptist Church kicked out Miller, or rather divorced itself from Millerism and his message, William Miller's preaching. And then some 20 years later, in 1890, well, let's see, what date was this? Let me rather share my screen and pick it up from the Memoirs of William Miller, which is a document that I downloaded some 7 years ago from Andrews University's archives. And I did my initial study on Adventist history when I was still an Adventist as well, a Seventh-day Adventist. And while learning from the Seventh-day Adventist archivist, whose website I'm going to share with you, Dr. Benjamin Baker. That's the man that did the study of Black Adventist pioneers in view of the whole in view of Adventist history as a whole. And my personal interest in Adventist history is because there are Jews in Adventism that need to know why they are in the movement and what they should do next in view of the coming of Messiah and in view of the redemption. This message and these videos might not even be for Adventists, but for Israelites and Jews in Adventism. But because we are generous in this channel, we are also doing this to answer questions of our dear Adventist friends, or should I say my dear Adventist friends. So when you watch these videos and judge my content, please know this is not the initiative of the Jewish community. It is a personal initiative. I am doing this because I'm a former Adventist. All right, so let's go back to where we kind of left off. So if you remember in the last video, the Millerite movement, I said, was based on eschatology, because the Westerners in America, they were tired of war and oppression from Europe and other things that were happening in the USA, like 2 wars, a civil war, and also another war that they had before the Civil War. So the worldview and expectations of white people in America were rather cynical. So William Miller revived an old Roman teaching, Christian teaching, that Jesus would come back again. And I mentioned that the coming back of Jesus is not biblical, but it was an apologetic because the church theologians could not explain or could not withstand the revelations of the rabbis. So, as an apologetic, they came up with that Jesus is coming back, since he did not satisfy the expectations of Jewish prophecy and Jewish tradition. But anyways, the second coming of Jesus serves in the Christian world as a revival. And William Miller and his followers needed that revival because of the cynicism caused by life in the West, in the Western world, and not only in America, but also in Europe, but also because of the wars. And one William Miller having been a soldier himself. So let's pick it up from that background. It says major works on the Millerite movement. Since 1844, the 1844 disappointment, numerous scholarly studies and publications have appeared that treat William Miller and American Adventism. I'm reading this wrong. Since the 1844 disappointment, I don't know why my phone always rings when I'm doing a lecture. Like, I'm really not interested in phone calls right now. Since the 1844 disappointment, numerous scholarly studies and publications have appeared that treat William Miller. Okay, that makes sense. And American Adventism. Now, I want you to notice something, that Adventism is American. Adventism is an American movement. It's an American spirituality. It doesn't have anything to do with Europe. It doesn't have anything to do with Africa. What makes it have something to do with Africa is because of the De Beers family that were in control of South Africa's economy and mineral resources through colonization, that they brought Seventh-day Adventism to South Africa. And I mentioned in the last video that Pastor Moko was the first Adventist pastor, and it was not a coincidence, because among the Basotho and the Xhosa people specifically, because Moko was a Xhosa, and among the Basotho and some Zulu clans, there are Israelites, biblical descendants of biblical Israelites, including yours truly. And so when the church speaks about a spiritual Israel, it is a deception, because it knows that within its ranks is real Israel. And if the people were told that they're real Israel, then they would go back to the Jewish worldview and the study of the Jewish scriptures. So they would effectively leave Christianity. So I'm not blaming Adventism for the teaching of being spiritual Israel, but I pin that on Christianity, that it is part of Christian teachings. Anyways, there are several general periods or eras in history of Millerite studies. First, there were the biographical and historical accounts of the movement written during Miller's life or shortly after his death by those who most closely associated with him. Between 1874 and 1920, a few apologetic biographies and historical studies were published by Adventist individuals, organizations. Third, from the 1920s to about the 1950, readers had to choose between either anecdotal or critical approaches or apologetic works by Adventists. The first formal academic studies of the Millerite movement appeared during this period, which is 1920s to 1950. Fourth, in about 1950, a transition began that would bring Millerite studies more into the mainstream of academic thought in the United States. By the 1970s and 80s, numerous historians emerged who focused on Millerite Adventism within the context of the social, economic, and cultural setting of the 19th century antebellum America. Antebellum means after the war. It would be noted that during the 20th century, only a few studies gave particular attention to the internal dynamics of theology of the Millerite movement. Those that did were invariably produced by Adventists. Today, a need remains for scholarly biographical study of William Miller and attention to particular aspects of Millerism. So, in the last video, you understood why William Miller started making the postulations and suggestions and prophecies that he made. It's because of the delusion of the world in America after the war. Good news for you is this episode here picks up from, or rather, this lecture picks up from William Miller's life and biography. But once I finish reading this to you or highlighting some things, we're going to go into Black Adventist pioneers and understand their thinking. And then the video afterwards, I'm going to start opening the books and propositions of theology by the prominent pioneers of Virgin Adventism. The reason why I call it Virgin Adventism, I'm referring to Adventism before the General Conference of 1888, where everybody took whatever direction that they wanted, theologically and otherwise. So Virgin Adventism from 1860 up to 1888. That's when the movement happened. In 1888, it died because then the space was saturated by Christians coming from other persuasions of Christianity, and they changed the direction and flavor of Seventh-day Adventism finally to what it is today. And I'm not here to judge Adventism, I'm here to tell the history. Perhaps the next decade will see these deficiencies addressed, it says. In this section, a brief overview will be given of the most important denominational, critical, or scholarly publications or about Miller and Millerism. It is not the purpose of this outline to be comprehensive, but rather highlight overall trends. For example, in 1874 and 1875, two significant works were published on Miller and the Adventist movement, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really interested in that. But the highlighted part says, this is now Ellen White. White acknowledged his heavy dependency upon Bliss's memoirs, though he did draw attention to correspondence by Miller that supported positions held by the Seventh-day Adventists. This is James White, because it says here, in 1875, James White, a Seventh-day Adventist, published a book-length biography of Miller titled Sketches of the Christian Life and Public Labors of William Miller. So this is important for you to understand. Am I sharing or am I talking to myself? Yeah, I'm still sharing. It is important for you to understand. I hope I'm sharing the right thing, actually. Yeah, I am. That's good. I just have to stay in the call. So, William Miller wrote this book looking at the memoirs of William Miller. What does it mean? It means James White is a Seventh-day Adventist. He inherits the mind of William Miller. He inherits the worldview of William Miller. He inherits the sermons and teachings of William Miller. It doesn't necessarily mean that he inherits something biblical. What the Adventists inherit are thoughts and understandings and proposals and a worldview within a white American Western society, Christian society. Seventh-day Adventism doesn't only, or at its foundation, it does not espouse Christian views per se, but its foundation is it highlights a specific corner of Christian thinking, which is Millerism. So Seventh-day Adventism is William Miller's thoughts and hopes, and the theology is developed upon these hopes and thoughts and proposals. Once disappointed, the movement, twice disappointed, but people kept on revisiting these ideas because of eschatology again. what will happen at the end of days. So it says here, this is now James White. He took the liberty to add a number of footnotes, some lengthy, that connected Miller's position to Seventh-day Adventist doctrine and experience. Indirectly, this publication was a response to Welcome's history. Some 20 years later, in 1895, the Adventist Christian Church, now from Millerism to an Adventist church, in 1860, published another book-length biography of Miller's life. Why was it important to have a church? Is because William Miller was abandoned by the Baptist church. It distanced itself because of the two failed prophecies. So on the ashes of a failed movement, the Baptist movement, and in William Miller's house, on his farm, in the barn, was born a new Christian church called an Adventist Christian Church, or Advent Christian Church. And then in 1863, it would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because this is just Advent Christian Church, because they believe in the second coming of Jesus. But now it became Adventist because there's another theological addition in 1863. Because obviously Advent means the coming, so they are waiting for the coming of Messiah. But that's the basis, not Messiah really, the coming of Jesus, because Messiah and Jesus are two different things. And I will explain this to you in another series when we talk about the New Testament. So they're waiting for the second coming of Jesus, and what makes them distinct from the Baptist church or other Christian denominations is because they are waiting for the coming of Jesus, and they discovered through a Baptist woman, a Baptist missionary, that in the Bible, God instituted the seventh day as a day of worship. So they adopted the Sabbath and they became Seventh-day Adventists. Welcome's history on the record kept by William Miller in 1839 to 1843, and an interview with Miller's youngest daughter, Lucienne Bartholomew. In 1915, the Seventh-day Adventist Church republished the Advent Christian biography with a tipped-in title page from their publishing house, the Review and Herald. So this is close to Ellen White's death date, but you can see that while she was still alive, there was an interest in the Millerite movement, which is the reason why the Adventist Church exists in any case. And then from 1920s to about 1950, a major shift in Adventist studies occurred as those directly connected with the 1844 experience passed away. So from after the death of Elder Bates and also Ellen White, in the period of the 1920s to 1950, there was a shift in Adventist studies. Interesting. The Adventist Christians and Seventh-day Adventists published histories of their denomination that included important elements from the Millerite period. These publications gave a broad history for the... Anyways, if you want the rest of this, you have to go into the Adventist archives, download Memoirs of William Miller, or go to Andrews University archives to download the memoirs. I just wanted this section. I didn't want the whole book. I just wanted this section for you to understand and for myself to understand why there was an Adventist movement in the beginning. So 7 years ago, when I did this study before leaving the church, it's because I saw in the church that the racism of Seventh-day Adventists was the same as that of right-wing Christian entities around the world, or denominations around the world, and communities. And I also had questions to answer for myself way back as an Adventist as to why the Adventist Church in South Africa supported apartheid, which is a system of segregation by race. They maintained it even in the training of ministers, of their pastors. So why was it important for the Seventh-day Adventist Church to maintain racist status quo during those days? It was because Adventism was planted in South Africa directly from America. Its flavor never changed, And as a result, when I was in the Adventist church, I could see that American Adventists sympathized with white South African Adventists after the liberation of Black people from Adventism, and white people tended to move, white Adventists tended to move from South Africa to the United States, where they have sympathizers in America because the worldview is the same. They still share the same right-wing Knights of Columbus type thinking and tendencies of propagating segregation. Now, I am not accusing them today of racism, and I'm not accusing them in any day of racism, but when I was a Seventh-day Adventist, there was clear racism, especially in South Africa. And when I got involved in missionary work internationally, I could see that there were a lot of sympathizers with apartheid thinking. And I did this study for myself to satisfy my own curiosity. So let's go see how much Black people contributed to Seventh-day Adventism. Actually, let's see how much Black people contributed to the Millerite movement as it was developing as the foundation of today's Seventh-day Adventism. So we cannot go anywhere else but to the source. Let's go to the works of Dr. Benjamin Baker, who is a Black man, an honest man. I love him to bits. And his website is Black Advent. Actually, it's probably a church website too, because he was, at that time, 7 years ago, he was the director and archivist of Adventist history. blacksdahistory.org. That's where it's at. That's where you can learn everything about Black people who contributed to Adventism. But I am going to just go through a few pioneers that maybe were not mentioned in books that were published about Adventist history. So, William Miller is born, or should I say, while William Miller is growing up and maturing, in 1814, May 23rd, a certain Airy Bar appears, and he's believed to have grown up to becoming the first Black Adventist minister born in Reading, Vermont. So Ariel Barr is the first African-American ex-slave who becomes an Adventist minister in South Africa. Pastor Moko in the early 1900s, he becomes the first Black Adventist minister. So as Adventism was developing in America, there was Black involvement. As it was developing in South Africa, there was obviously Black involvement. And I find it curious that it should prosper among the Xhosa people, who were one of the groups that I believe are part of biblical Israelites that assimilated to the Xhosa people, to the Xhosa culture. And during the time when Tsikana resisted the forced conversion to Christianity by Dutch missionaries. So God was seeing what was happening to Black people who have the seed of Israel, and he gave them Adventism as opposed to another type of Christianity. As I mentioned, in the Adventist movement, there are a lot of Jews in the Western world, but in the African context, there are a lot of Israelites. In fact, my former rabbi, who represents Southern Africa, was actually a Seventh-day Adventist preacher himself, interestingly enough. And a lot of Jews today that are, a lot of Jews that are coming out of the churches especially tend to be Seventh-day Adventists, descendants of slaves that are going back to their natural religion, which is the religion of Israel, of the Torah, Judaism. Anyways, let's blah, blah, blah. Let's read about this Bar Eli. Here it says that he died in Alma, Elgin, in Colorado. Is it Colorado? I'm not sure. But I think the state is New York, so it can't be Colorado. May 18, 1864, of consumption. What interesting. Brother E.L. Barr, age about 51 years. His mind was calm and he felt that death would be a sweet rest. He was at the residence of Brother Daniel Oviat, where he had the best care. The writer spoke on the occasion from Timothy, 2 Timothy 4, verse 7 and 8. Interesting statement. But it says here that Eli Barr was born in 1814 on the 23rd of May in Vermont. His father was William Barr, a free black man, or free black. Rather, a free black man, because a black is not a thing. We are people. We are people of African descendants, and not only African, but we are people also of Middle Eastern descendants, because Africans are not all native to Africa. Surprise, surprise. But Aries' maternity is unknown. Aries had two older brothers, Norman William Jr., who died before he was born, and a younger brother, Horace, in 1815. He also had three sisters, Alva, Phoebe, and CB. They're all recorded in the census as colored or black, though in later records, Aries would be listed as mulatto, which means he was half black and half white, which is a derogatory term back then of children who were born of masters and slaves. So go to this address here to read the blah, blah, blah. I'm just interested in his involvement in Adventism. So the year 1844 was pivotal for Barr, who was a firm believer in the doctrine of the imminent advent of Christ. This is the foundation of Millerism, not the foundation of the Bible, not the foundation of the message of the Bible. We're not judging Seventh-day Adventists here. I'm merely highlighting that the basis of Adventist doctrine is the mind and thoughts, mistakes, and hopes and dreams of William Miller. The second coming of Christ is not the message of the Bible. In the Christian Bible, which was produced by the Romans, yes, it is a message. But in the context of the biblical world and the real Bible, which in the Christian Bible you can read Genesis to Malachi, in the real Bible it ends with Second Chronicles as the last book, not Malachi. We'll do that in textual criticism sometime in the future on this channel. So the beliefs on the hopes and dreams of Adventism are built on William Miller, and William Miller's hopes and dreams and worldview is built on Christian apologetics, not Christian doctrine, Christian apologetics to the Jewish people about getting it wrong about Jesus as Messiah. So anyways, this became the foundation of Christianity, this Millerite thinking. So Barr was also impacted, in this by this doctrine. And then when Jesus did not appear on October 22, just over a month after the Great Disappointment on November 29, 1844, Barr wrote to the editor of the Millerite paper, The Voice of Truth, with an inspiring message for the disappointed. There remains little company whose trust is in the living God, that took to God his word, whose faith grows stronger and stronger. The disappointment was necessary because these Christians did not believe in God as the one who is going to give the revelation. They believed in the second coming of Christ, which is not a biblical doctrine or any doctrine in the Bible, but it is an apologetic. It's an answer, it's a political statement to say that Jesus is coming back, a political statement against the teachings of the Torah and the Jewish people, specifically the rabbis. And so there had to be a disappointment. And this disappointment did not need to bring the Seventh-day Adventists closer to Christ. It needed to bring them closer to the God of Abraham, Yaakov, and Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the Adventist, can I call it, what can I call this? What Adventists should have gleaned from the disappointment, gleaning is the word I was looking for, but I was thinking in Spanish, la cosecha adventista. What they should have gleaned and harvested from the disappointment is that, hey, maybe let's put eschatology and our own thinking aside. Let's find out exactly who God is and what his intention for us as Westerners who do not want to conform to the pattern of the Western world or Christianity. How can we reach God? How can we reach out to God and know his ways? That should have been the gleaning. Later in March 11, 1846, issue of the Voice of Truth, Barr wrote of those isolated brothers and sisters who speak to each other through the voice of truth, as it happens to be the only way they could do it, who are clothed in the spotless robe waiting. It is unknown if Barr was ever a Millerite minister, though he was active in witnessing to others. The US Census of 24 August 1850 records the 36-year-old Barr as a mechanic with a household in Goshen Gore, now called Stannard, Vermont, that included his wife, daughter, mother-in-law, young brother Horace. The Barrs were the only blacks in the small community. With regarding to his ministry, let's see some. So he was a Sabbatarian. He accepted the Millerite movement, but also the Sabbatarian Adventist message. You must remember the Sabbatarian part of Adventism doesn't come from the Adventist pioneers. It comes from the Seventh-day Baptists. Sabbatarianism in Christianity is brought back by the Baptists because the Baptists had a degree of honesty in their interpretation of the Bible. Even though it's a Christian Bible, it has been modified to suit the Christian world by Roman scholars. There is still biblical truth. The person can still find God in it. And so the pioneers, for example, not the pioneers, the Seventh-day Baptists, I studied under some Baptist instructors at Nations University in Louisiana, and they are very, very honest about the scriptures, even though it is from a Christian perspective of Christian hopes, sidelining Jewish thought. So in Christianity, since the inception of Christianity, being Sabbatarian is written or coded into the New Testament as Judaizing. Judaizing and Judaizers, basically a derogatory term for Jews that had converted to this Christianity, but they wanted to continue their Jewish ways, and they were called Judaizers. And Judaizers would be persecuted a lot, especially when the church became Roman. And so it was impossible for a long time to become a Sabbatarian, but the Baptists were true to the scriptures, even though they had them as modified. They introduced the Sabbath, the Seventh-day Baptists, to the Seventh-day Adventists. So by the time Barr accepts the Sabbatarian Adventism, or rather his acceptance of it, is not from the Millerite movement, but from the Baptist, the Seventh-day Baptist movement. When I was studying theology and I had not come back to Judaism, I actually thought I was going to become a Seventh-day Baptist. I was going back to Seventh-day Baptism, and I wanted to go to the California Baptist University to do my PhD one day there. But thank God I remembered who I was, and I came to Judaism running after discovering the biblical truth, both through the searching of scriptures, but also through studying theology and realizing what theology really is: politics about God, politics against the Jews. So anyways, we can see that Barr had a relationship with James and Ellen White in his ministry. The Whites first met Ari Barr in Wilcott, Vermont, blah, blah, blah. All right. I'm not going to read all of this. Please come to this web address for you to read the whole story. All I'm doing here is just trying to tell you that the Adventist church, that when I was an Adventist, I found racist in many areas, it actually had black pioneers. Second pioneer is John West. We're not going to read much. I'm just showing you. Please come to this web address. come to this web address and study for yourself. So we have Eri Bar. Now we have John West. All right, so when you click on John West, you're going to come to the YouTube channel of Black SDA History. Remember, through these lectures, I'm not telling you to leave Adventism. This lecture might not even be for you, but what I'm trying to do is that the Jews and Israelites that are in Adventism must know that the Adventist movement was not a mistake. It was bringing them, since they were converted to Christianity, when they found Adventism, it's a way of them finishing their reformation. When you finish your reformation, you come out of the Christian churches into the Seventh-day Adventism, which is the penultimate or pre-penultimate step of finishing your reformation. From Seventh-day Adventists, naturally, you will be attracted to Messianic Judaism, which is the last step of the Reformation. It's still Christian, and after you've spent some time in Messianic Judaism, you're going to discover the Bible and its truth, and you're going to come back to the real deal, the real Adventism. So, sorry, not Adventism, to the real Judaism. So when you click on John West, you're going to go end up on YouTube to find that video. Okay, so here's a link for William Foy, but it's not available. William Ellis Foy is the only, I think, Black pioneer who's mentioned in Adventist history as told by Westerners. But I encourage Black Adventists to learn the Black contributions to Adventism. Why is it important to Black people in America? Because Black people in America have a large probability to have been Jewish or Israelite, because they were taken from West Africa as slaves to America. And that region was full of Israelite kingdoms and Jewish people. As late as the 1730s, Africa was recognized by missionaries, especially West Africa, as being Jewish. And then there was William J. Hardy. It says he was a Black Adventist and the first elected Black politician in the state of Michigan. Wow. And then there was William F. Menisi, who was one of the first Black Adventists born in New York State. Interesting, and blah, 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 etc., etc. So please come to this website and learn about your Adventist movement and the massive contribution of Black people to Seventh-day Adventism. So William Foy will be converted to Adventist and baptized by Silas Curtis, the pastor. Oh, hold on. Even before he becomes a Seventh-day Adventist, he's converted to the message, I guess, of Adventism in some way by the Free Will Baptist Church in August, Maine. That's interesting history. So I'm not going to go through it and bore you with it, but I just want to show you that Black people are in the heart of Adventist pioneer history. And it was important for them to find Sabbatarianism because some of them, I believe, were Jews and Israelites, not just from the white Adventists, which is obvious because white Adventists come from Europe, and in Europe were Jews who were converted by force to Christianity. So a lot of Christians, not just Adventists who come from Europe, are actually have Jewish blood in them. And then there's the Adventist part of it, which is Miller's Hopes and Dreams. Anyways, this is the timeline. I want you to come to this address, and I want you to read all these biographies for yourself. I am honestly not interested in them, but to me, they are important because a former Jewish people, not former, a Jewish people that don't know that they are Jewish, Black people and Israelites, they found themselves in the only movement in Christianity that would bring them closer to the Jewish message than the Christian message. What I'm going to do when we finish the pioneers, we're going to look at Adventist doctrines. And we're going to use a book that's used at Andrews University called well, it should be used in every Adventist university. It wasn't used for some time, but of late, I heard that it's being used, and that's questions on doctrine. Then we're going to answer all the doctrinal propositions. But for now, I just want to dwell on the pioneers. So now you know that Adventism is not a white movement, even though it became in a white part of the United States. But Black people from the beginning were as much a part of Adventism as the early pioneers. However, the foundation of Adventism are the aspirations, propositions, and hopes of one William Miller. The Sabbath was given to the Seventh-day Adventists by the Baptists. Anyways, I'm going to end this video here. Please go to those links that I showed you and read about Black Adventist pioneers that did amazing things. All right, I don't want to go through it all in a video. I'll just have you read it. But if you are a Jew in Adventism listening to this, or you have Jewish heritage, or if you are an African American, this is not your final home. Seventh-day Adventism is not your final spiritual home, because you have Jewish and Israelite roots, most probably.